let's talk about medieval sandwiches. Okay, so you
Yes.
said something funny earlier, which was you've seen how people will reference grabbing a sandwich for the road or for their fantasy story, and that's something that grinds your gears. Why? Why do you? What's your problem with medieval sandwiches?
Mostly because sandwiches are a relatively modern thing. Like if you go back into the history of it, the Earl of Sandwich, right? He was playing cards and he didn't want to get his hands dirty, and so he asked his servants to put meat inside of slices of bread, right?
Mhm.
That's a much later, like Victorian era thing than
Mhm.
medieval, right? Like in
Yeah.
medieval era, people were eating soups and stews and roast, game and all these things. They didn't think to put anything inside pieces of bread. They just ate the bread by itself, right?
Or they
But
use the bread as the platter, and then
yes,
the rich would like take that platter and give it to the poor people who were able to taste all the, that's their
yes,
fine dining.
exactly. So having a sandwich and calling it a sandwich
Hmm.
is a really specific thing, right?
Yeah.
And it just, to me, and I hate to call other authors lazy because I know how much work goes into writing, but it just seems like, well, my characters need to eat. What am I going to feed them, right? Well, they're going to eat sandwiches because it's maybe what I feed my kids. I don't know,
Hmm.
So it's just the kind of the go-to thing,
Hmm.
even though it really doesn't fit at all. Um, and yeah, in my works, I try to distance myself from as many earth things as I can, right? Like if they're gonna, like, they do eat food, they take a piece of bread, they tear out the metal, they put stuff in it, and they eat it, right? But they
Hmm.
don't call it a sandwich because
Yeah, yeah.
nobody named
Hasn't been
sandwiches
invented
in that
yet.
world, right?
Right.
So because that just shows a little bit extra, that you're thinking about what goes into your characters, thinking about what goes into your world
Mhm.
more than just sort of applying the generic stuff that everybody else does.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, friends, welcome to the Legend Fiction Show, or this is a series that we host called Legend Makers. And I'm the host, founder of Legend Fiction, Dominic, and we're joined today by Zephyr Thomas. Hi, Zephyr, again. Welcome to the
Hello.
show. So, Zephyr's been a member of the community for how long now? 2 years? It's like
Really long time, yeah.
a long time. I think you're one of the earliest members, and you've been in there just writing for a while and being involved. I think you won the Legend Haven story contest last year.
It did, yes.
So kudos on that. I remember actually I read that one aloud to everybody because
You,
that was one of the things that we were
yes,
doing.
you did. I called my
Um,
family and I said, "Hey, Mr. Dominic's reading the story right now. Everybody come in here and listen." They
it
were
was fun.
stoked.
I loved how where you went with the story, and it was there was so much levity in it. I mean, yes, there was wizards and there were sort of these magical dragon battling situations, but you did really, really cool and interesting things. So I hope people check the link in the description. They can visit your website. But what we're going to talk about today is one, you're trying to carve out a new niche for yourself, which you're calling rural fantasy. I want to ask you about that. Why? But before we get to that, you've got 3 books now that you have written yourself. I think you've got them sitting on your desk. You can wave them around. You can show them to us. If you would, just walk us through that. And then I want to ask you your story. How did you get to be writing all of these things? But show us your stories and your latest book.
Yeah, sure. The first book that I published is called Octave of Stars.
Hmm.
You might have seen this one. It is set in our world. It's not a rural fantasy story. It's a spiritual adventure because one of the big themes about it, you can see my reflection there. One of the big themes is that it's basically a Catholic superhero story.
Okay.
The characters are able to control the different elements. Ash over here is able to control fire, and Cascadia, who's his not girlfriend, is able to control water. Um,
Okay.
but instead of it just being a straight superhero story of people slinging magical things at each other, their faith is a really important part of their lives, and
Hmm.
the characters do things like pray before they fight with each other. They go to mass. They pray the
Wow.
rosary at one point, even though it's kind of a setup for a joke, but still, those things are important in their lives, and they make sure to include them.
Hmm.
I don't shy away from that because a lot of superhero stuff kind of ignores religion altogether. Like
Yeah.
they never talk about that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
So that was something that I wanted to make sure was a big part of it.
Hmm.
So that one is technically a YA book, is how it's classified, for teens who are kind of. I was trying to market specifically to boys because a lot of the YA fantasy stuff is for girls. It like has really strong female characters who kind of tear down the men and sort of
Mm.
stomp over top of them, and that is not in there at all.
Yeah,
Everybody
yeah.
works together. The men and the women, all combine their efforts and work with each other,
Hmm.
which I think is really important
I
to
have to,
showcase as well.
before you move on, what is the meaning of the title Octave of Stars? Why did you pick that?
There are several meanings of that title, actually.
Okay.
The story takes place over a total of 8 days.
Okay.
Uh, that's the first octave. There are 8 characters. There are 8 stars who can control different elements.
Okay.
So there's 8 of those, and they also fight with each other. There's 8 different battle scenes in the book. So
Okay.
yeah, that's there's
What prompted that book? Like, why did you get into writing that story?
that story was an idea I've had for a really really long time.
Yeah.
Um, but the characters ended up changing kind of a lot over the the gestation time, I would say,
Hmm.
the seeding time of the story. I like germination is a good one for the whole rural thing. Um, so yeah, it was just something that I wanted to do. I thought it would be fun to have these different characters because they're all pretty diverse, right? Like one of them, like several of them are kind of older characters, some of them are younger.
Hmm.
They're people from different walks of life who are all united by the fact that they can all control a certain element in a certain way,
Hmm.
and just kind of how they come together and how their struggles and conflicts are like that. And
Nice.
it's there's definitely lower stakes than most things, right? They don't have to save the world, um, but they just have to save the city, right?
Yeah.
So that's it. So
Well,
it's kind of
that's
the
yeah, their world. I wish
yeah,
more superhero movies would do that. Like, just calm down on the existential stakes and just come back to just trying to save Aunt May or you're just Uncle Ben.
right, yeah, yeah, for sure.
So, second
Um,
book, then what's that one that you've
yeah.
written?
So the second book is called Paper and Feathers.
Uh huh.
It is the first book in the Euphony of Seasons. You can see the title there.
I've
Um,
not. I'm not familiar with the
the
word euphony. Can you unpack that for us?
Yes, so a symphony is
Yeah.
musical unity, bringing together
Okay.
different instruments and harmonies. So a euphony is the harmony of different words,
Ooh.
spoken or written, usually spoken, coming together like that.
Okay.
Because their entire world literally revolves around the seasons, right? They
Okay.
use them for to mark time. They use them for metaphors, right? Everything. So it's kind of hard to get that lined up there. The
It's good. We got it.
the
Yeah.
characters and the illustrations are done by my wife.
Wow.
Illustrations by Michelle Thomas. She and I have been working on this pretty much since we got married
That's amazing.
about 20 years ago.
And it's a hardback too. What a beautiful looking
Yes, it's
thing.
a case wrap. It's a single scene from front to back on the back
Hmm.
of the book. It's the street where they are. There's all these different kinds of people. There's all these different, they'd be called fantasy races in most media,
Hmm.
but they're not really. They're more just different kinds of people, right?
Okay.
Um, People say, well, why didn't you just call this person here a wolf person, right? Well, they're not. Why didn't you call this person a bird person? Well, they're not, right? They have characteristics and qualities of animals, but they're not animal people. That was a big thing to try to
Intriguing.
get
So, what's
into
the
readers'
blurb for
heads.
Paper and Feathers?
The blurb for okay, so this guy here, his name is
Yeah.
Alden. He's a
Okay.
librarian. This lady here, her name is Rhea. She's a librarian. She works with him, right? So Alden is called to a rural city, a rural remote place where this book, the cover is set,
Hmm.
to identify a mysterious book that no one will tell him anything about, right? So right away there's this intrigue, like why is this book so important? What's the big deal? What's going on? Um, and then over the course of this journey to figure out, why have his superiors sent him to this place, he ends up going on a spiritual journey of his own. He ends up kind of discovering new things about himself, kind of opening his eyes to the world that's around him, right?
Hmm.
And he ends up, I'm not going to spoil things, but he ends up going through some pretty significant changes in his life.
Okay.
So it's just the story of that journey that he goes on, right? There's no evil, there's no dark lord, there is a villain, but he's a really small villain, right? In
Hmm.
comparison to most fantasy stuff.
Hmm.
Um, so it just ends up being a much smaller, able to focus directly on him and
Hmm.
directly on his struggles and what he does.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, and this is just the first book in the long planned line of other stories that are going to come along with it as well.
Oh, how cool. And
Um,
I think you said you're so okay, what's the inspiration for this one? We'll come back and talk about rural fantasy in a minute, but what inspired this story? Why does it matter to you?
the story matters to me a lot because his Alden's journey is a lot like my own. He kind of becomes more aware of the world around him and sort of starts moving away from city life and into more of rural life, which is something that I've done as well, right? Um,
Okay.
we when we lived in Idaho, it was southern Idaho, so it wasn't exactly like a huge metropolis, but we're definitely in the city. And now where we are in southern Indiana, it's a lot more, woods and farms and all these things.
Wow.
And where we live right now is about 6.5 acres of mostly pasture and then a little bit of woods, right?
Wow.
So we're
Okay.
really deep into nature, really deep into, there's animals all over the place. There's birds and deer and all these
Okay.
things. And so just that kind of moving from, I know we don't have enough time to talk about all of my gardening journey, but just being aware that there's more to life than just what's right in front of your nose, and um, gardening and cultivation and being aware of how the world works on a deeper level
Hmm.
is something that's is a really important theme of the book. So
That's really cool. That's fast. Well, okay, let's keep moving. What's your third book then? Hold that one up. I think you
the
just finished that one, right?
yeah,
Just launched
this
it?
one is kind of hot off the presses. It just arrived here this week. This one is the called Phoebe and the All Lands Tournament. It's kind of a long
Uh-huh.
title. It's inspired by a story that was a story from my children.
Oh, really?
My kids like to play with their stuffed animals, and my daughter has come up with all of this stories and all of this lore and all these characters about her. She has a stuffed griffin, actually. So that's what that's
Okay.
supposed to be. She
Okay.
did draw the cover art. She's our cover designer for this one. And so it's just kind of a fun, silly little story about it's set in a world that's kind of like Pokemon, right? The characters all have these creatures, these beasts and robots and all these things that sort of they're bonded to and they follow along with them.
Hmm.
And so this one is set at a tournament that all these different people have come to, and they sort of compete in different ways. And of course, you have something like Pokemon, they start fighting, right? That's
Hmm.
the go-to thing. And I remember my wife said, "Can you have them do something other than fight? Like, what else can they do in order to compete? That's not just like hitting each other." Like, okay, that's a good idea. So there's only one fighting event. There's three other events that they do that aren't combat.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's just kind of it's a cute little story
Okay,
for
you can't leave us
kids.
hanging. So what are some ideas that these Pokemon characters are doing that are not fighting?
Well, so they race.
Okay.
So the main character Rari is a griffin,
Hmm.
so he can fly, obviously.
Okay.
So there's an air race where he flies alongside other flying creatures and tries to get
Hmm.
to win. And they also do a log pull, is what they call it. So they strap themselves onto a huge log and try to pull it across the finish line
Wow.
first.
Okay.
Um, yeah,
Okay.
so it's a lot of fun.
That seems like such an amazing gift to be able to give your well your family. I mean your children to be able to take their imagination and their stories and to condense it into a hardback like that. Like
Yeah.
so. I mean, just my goodness. So you just finished that one, and I think
Mhm.
what you're self-publishing all of these. It's this like a family project. You're involving your family in these things that you're doing.
Yep.
Why are you opting the self-publishing route as opposed to I don't know, what do you call it, conventional publishing or traditional publishing?
Tradition. Yeah. I kind of knew right away that I wanted to be a self-published author, just
Hmm.
because of a lot of it had to do with distribution.
Okay.
Because I don't list any of my books on Amazon on
Okay.
purpose,
Yeah.
um, and so I knew that if I tried to do traditional publishing, it wouldn't be up to me, right? They would say, "Well, we're
Yeah.
going to put it on Amazon because that's where it's going to sell."
Hmm.
Um, and after thinking about it and praying about it a lot, it really came down to the fact that I'm not trying to sell books, right? I
Mm.
mean, I don't really sell very many books, right?
Mhm.
What I want is to people to read my stories. I want people to be able to read them, experience them, have them be a part of their lives. Um, and so, being able to control things in a better way,
Mhm.
was really important to me. I didn't want there to be the editorial oversight of, well, we have to, we're going to change this because this is what's going to sell.
Mm.
I remember hearing from another Catholic author that they submitted a manuscript to a publisher, and they said, well, this is fine, except there has to be a priest in it. Well, why? Because it's a Catholic story, so there has to be a priest in it. Like, well,
Okay.
okay, so they rewrote it and they added a priest character and it made the publisher happy. And I remember thinking, I am not, no way am I going to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
No way do I want that to be something that is part of what I'm doing, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm telling this story in a specific way, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm just, that's how it's going to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Paper and Feathers is a very non-traditional story in the larger sense of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because most of these, most fantasy type things have the hook that pulls you in the first 5 pages, right?
Yeah.
Well, it takes kind of a long time to figure out what the hook is in this story, which will frustrate some readers and it will intrigue just as many other readers. They'll say,
Mm-hmm.
well, this is interesting. I've never read anything like this, you know? And I hear that's what I've heard people say is I've never read anything like this. And
Cool.
if I
Yeah.
had gone through traditional publisher, then they would be reading something like what everybody else is reading, because that's what everybody else
Yeah.
is writing,
Yeah.
you know? So that, yeah, that was important for me to make sure that I
Mm-hmm.
had that control to say, no, this is the story we're telling, and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. You've shown over the last couple of years being in the community, you have strong opinions and you'll hold to them. And it's really cool and refreshing. What is your story? How did you get to where you are now? You mentioned Idaho and now 6 acres in,
Indiana.
I've drawn about Indiana. That's right. What, how did you get to this point now where gardening and farming and this rural thing is so valuable to you?
Well, okay. So Wendell Berry is an author that you definitely want to read if you're interested in that. He writes a
Hmm.
lot about like agriculture and commercial farming is really
Hmm.
important to him.
Yeah.
And so I started reading some of his works and realizing that our food system is broken, right? Our agricultural system is not working, right? We
Yeah.
don't work with the land; we work with for money, right?
Hmm.
And that's just not how agriculture was ever supposed to be.
Hmm.
Um, and then so my wife and I decided we're gonna let's gonna do some gardening. We're gonna start growing some of our own food.
Nice.
We had a pretty big backyard where we were in Idaho, and so right before we started to do this, COVID happened, and
Oh,
so we were like, well, I guess we're gardening now because but we decided to do it before it was cool. So that was the thing. So I borrowed one of those sod cutters and literally cut all of the grass up in our backyard. There was
okay.
just bare dirt. We lived on a quarter of an acre, so it was a pretty big backyard.
Yeah.
And we put down planter boxes and we ordered fresh dirt to be hauled in, and then we grew 12 planter boxes worth of food,
Mhm.
plus melons and tomatoes and literally everything we could think of. We just went through the seed
Amazing.
catalog and we're like, yep,
Yeah.
want that, got all of it. Uh, so we grew a lot of food. I think I tallied it up. It was over 500 pounds of food that one year, just from our backyard. Um,
Did you end up eating all of that? Did you can it? Did you give it away? Like that sounds like a lot of
well,
produce.
pumpkins are pretty heavy, and so are watermelons, but you don't really get a lot out of the watermelons.
Yeah.
No, we ate it all. Yeah, and
Wow.
and so then we thought, yeah, this is it. This is what we're going to do.
That's amazing.
You know, and so then, we I was continuing to work from home. We decided, I asked my company, where I work at from home anywhere, and they said, sure, absolutely. So we found a place, we found a state that has really good land prices, state that has really good homeschooling laws. We decided to move out here. It took us a little while to find the place where we are now. But now we've got, a garden that's just about as big as we had before. We've got the space, I could take the tiller out there and I could just clear, way more space for all these things if we wanted to. Um, so yeah, just one of the important things about gardening really is that it kind of gets you back onto God's time, right?
Mhm.
Because it
Yeah.
doesn't take, I think about like farming games like Farmville all the time, right? They kind of spoil people. They're like, well, you put a
Mhm.
strawberry in the ground, you get it in 3 minutes. Like,
Yeah.
no, that's not how it works. Um,
Yeah.
that you really have to wait. You have to be patient. You have to take care of it. You have to
Yeah.
cultivate it and nurture it.
Hmm.
And that's something that is, I think, really important for people to get back to, right?
Hmm.
Because we go to the store and there's food and you just eat it and you don't even think about it, right? You don't think about where it came from, how it got there. Um, so getting back to that is, I think, something that's really important for a lot of people. Um, and there's other movements that I've been following that are kind of trying to get people back on that. Jason Craig is one of them. Sword and
Okay.
Spade magazine for men is something that people can look into.
Mhm.
Just trying to get people to get back to that agricultural rural state of
Mhm.
mind instead of us striving towards industrialism and big cities and all these
Yeah.
things. And I think in a way that the publishing industry is really like that too, right? Like, yeah, people, I look through a lot of these fantasy stories, that people are coming out with today, and they're all kind of the same. It's
Hmm.
all, a plucky female heroine tries to prove herself against the regime and, you know, beat down everybody in her
Takes it all
way,
down before Tuesday.
and that's just kind of boring. Um, but people don't know any better. They've gotten to the point with their literature they do with their food, right? They just
Mm.
consume it without thinking, right? And so I'm trying to get back to saying, well, here's something that's different. Here's something
Hmm.
that's not what you would find on the bookshelf anywhere else.
Hmm. I like
um,
that. Yeah. So have
and
you always been a writer?
yes, I have always been a writer. I still have files on floppy disk from the stories that I wrote when I was a kid on my old 86 x86 computer. I have dot matrix
Wow.
printouts of the stories that I wrote.
Wow.
Yeah, I've always had ideas. I read a lot of comic books when I was a kid, and so I just
Hmm.
sort of took those ideas and those characters and synthesized them into my own characters. Then I started reading books, fantasy novels, and things, and sort of taking those ideas.
Hmm.
Once I started playing video games, those were another big influence because the plots and the stories were really important to me,
Hmm.
and just all that kind of kept following me through the years and kept coming with me, until eventually, I'm where I am today. I try to write down every single idea I have. I
Wow.
look at it and I'm like, there's no way I can write all of this in my lifetime,
What
but
tools do you use to
I've
write, to keep
I've done
track
it.
of stuff and write it down?
I use Zoho
Okay.
Notebook, and Zoho Writer are
Gotcha.
the suite that I use. They're a technology company that is sort of what they compete with Google, right? They
Hmm.
have a product for everything. They have email, they
Okay.
have calendar, they have all the things. So I've used their stuff for quite a while. Um, I use for actually like getting stuff ready for publishing. I do use Scrivener,
Hmm.
because it's really good for organizing and for actually outputting the EPUB files that you can
That's
then
helpful.
distribute.
Very, yeah, yeah.
Um, but for the actual like drafting and things, I use Zoho Notebook and Zoho Writer for
Hmm.
those. Just because I trust the company that has the data. It's in a
Hmm.
place where I can easily access it.
Yeah.
So
So, okay, we're now able to tackle the last question, which is you're trying to create, or maybe not trying to create, contribute to, or be a part of, or build a niche that you're calling rural fantasy. And now that we've walked through some of these other questions, I can start to see now why it makes so much sense and why it's so close to your heart. Can you walk us now through then? Why are you in love with this genre or this space of rural fantasy, and the stories that you're creating are exploring that or a part of that?
hmm um, I think it's important for a lot of different reasons. I think that our lives are as a whole are already kind of stressful and high stakes, right? Like people go through a lot on a daily basis,
Yeah.
um,
Hmm.
and so I think that's one of the reasons why the cozy fantasy genre is so popular, is because it's just kind of sitting back and relaxing at a coffee shop with this book, um, which is it's good. It's something that is that people should be able to do. But I kind of want to move. I'm trying to move beyond the coffee shop. Like, what else
Mm-hmm.
is there in that world
Mm-hmm.
outside of this, right? Like the fact that a coffee shop exists in a fantasy world implies that there's enough peace as a whole. Like the country and the economy are strong enough
Mm-hmm.
that they can support something like that. They don't have to worry about getting raided by barbarians
Yeah.
every 2 weeks. So what else is out there in that world?
Hmm.
And I've
Also, it
spent a
assumes
long.
trade routes, right? Because in most of these places, coffee isn't grown
Right.
natively; it's imported, as opposed to local beers, which supply taverns or something.
Exactly. Yeah. That is another thing, is that in the traditional medieval fantasy world, everything is really local because they had to be, right. They didn't have a way to transport things, right.
Hmm.
So in the rural fantasy world that I have, there is uh, like there's air shipping. They have airships. They can travel across the world, right.
Hmm.
They can transport goods and things across the world, but they don't do globalization like we do it here, right?
Mm. Okay.
They don't grow huge fields of things. And I mean,
Hmm.
I'm in Indiana. I've seen these enormous cornfields that go on literally until the horizon. You can't see the end of them, right? They don't do that. They do things much smaller. They have their local communities, right, that are sort of self-contained,
Mhm.
but then people trade in between them, right? Like one place grows something that's really unique, and so someone will come and trade it for another thing, but they don't do it on like a huge, massive scale like we do here. Um, and one of the other big things that they have in their world is they have information technology. They have devices that allow them to communicate over long distances. Um, but unlike smartphones, they are not able to consume other media off of them. All they can do is really communicate with them, right? That's all they
Mhm.
do. But so that connects the world in a different way than our world is connected, right? Because it's more of the personal connection between two people, right? Like they're called compasses, the devices they use to communicate. They literally have to touch each other in order to be linked together to be able to talk
Mm.
to each other, right?
Oh,
So
interesting.
you can't just look somebody up in a directory, but you have
Hmm.
to actually meet them in person. Say, yes, I want to make this long distance connection with you. Here, let's do that, right?
Hmm.
Uh, so that's one of the big things that helps them, stay connected without being, over connected. I think like we are
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, so I could talk about this world for hours and hours. Um, but they're really big about agriculture too. They make sure that people there, one of their religions is based primarily around like agriculture and natural things.
Hmm.
One of the other religions is based on art and creation and how people can contribute to that. Um, and it really comes back to that economic theory, right? I was listening to the Liturgy of the Land podcast a little while ago, and they were talking about economy. They were talking about how our economic model is based around how everything is scarce,
Hmm.
right? People are convinced that um, that there's not enough to go around, and
Hmm.
so everybody has to compete for all the resources that are available. Um, and then that really struck me because there's another book that I read that I think you could definitely contribute it. It could definitely count as a cozy fantasy. It's called The Ogress and the Orphans
Okay.
by Kelly Barnhill. You should read that one too if you get a chance. The ogress of the story lives in the woods outside this village, and she grows food and she gathers food from the woods and gives it to the villagers, like under the cover of night, like they don't know
Hmm.
she's doing it, right? And one of the central themes of the book is that by giving, you have more, right? When you give of yourself and when you give of your time to others, you have more. And so that really connected with me because if the economic model of a world was there is enough to go around, right? Everybody can get enough. There's no need to compete over resources. That would really change the way that a world worked and that people lived in that world, right? Because they would have that inner peace of knowing I don't have to fight for my food, right?
Yeah.
I don't have to compete with other people in that way. That they will be taken care of and they will be provided for,
Hmm.
right? Which ultimately comes all the way back to us relying on God, right?
Hmm.
Because if we
Yeah.
know that God is going to provide for us, He's going
Hmm.
to take care of us, right? In a immediate temporal way, yeah, we do have to feed ourselves. We do have to find our own resources, but
Hmm.
on the large scheme of things, we will be taken care of. Um, so I thought that should be the basis of how this world works, right? Is that people know they're going to get what they need, right, and that
Hmm.
they don't have to fight for it, and the economy can then come at it from a completely different angle, right? Of course, that's not to say that everybody in this world is happy and peaceful, right? Of course, there are people who don't like what they have, who are
Yeah.
greedy and grasping, right? But when you look at the majority of fantasy, everybody's like that.
Hmm.
Everybody's greedy and graspy. Everybody's trying to backstab everybody, right? And that just gets really overwhelming after a while. Like everybody's fighting, everybody's
Hmm.
nonstop. This just is nonstop. You know, I don't know what to call it. Uh, yeah, it just makes it really hard to ever feel peaceful when you're reading these
Hmm.
books.
Okay.
Like what's going to happen next? Who's going to get screwed over next? Who's going to get hurt next? Right?
Hmm.
Um, and why do we want to read something like that when our own lives are already so hard, right? When
Hmm.
it's already so difficult. So that's where that's where the rural fantasy really comes in. Is that you know the world is at peace. There isn't a dark evil wizard trying to threaten the security of it. The
Hmm.
characters can just have their struggles and they can just have their problems
Hmm.
on a much smaller level,
Hmm.
right? And not worry about that. Um, yeah.
I think this is beautiful, and I guess to wrap up, the last question to sort of ask you is maybe a deeper one, because you've mentioned the word spirituality several times and you've hinted at the religions in the world. And what I'm hearing you outline is how you see the world. And so, what is your spirituality as your what you've just described about how God relates to the world and how we should be relating to the world, and then the creation of this sort of fictive space where we can get reintroduced to this slower, healthy, healthful, cyclical relationship with a fruitful universe that's good for us. You know, and it's like this all sounds like a beautiful. How do you say? It's a spirituality. It's a philosophy. It's a way to live. You know, yeah. What is you know, we're Catholics, and this show is produced for people who are looking to not fuse faith into their fiction. You know, and this is what I'm liking hearing about how you're talking about all this stuff. You're not trying to like shoehorn Christianity into something. You're actually using your fiction to reveal an experience of how to imagine the world that can ladder you up to maybe your own path of discovery into God or something. That's a very open question. What answers come to your mind as you're hearing that?
Yeah, totally. That's definitely been a big inspiration for it. I mean, the first story in the book, and the first story in the series, I always like to say that it's the first book in the Euphony of Seasons series, but not book one, right? Because everybody, you see book one, you're like, well, there's going to be a book two. Like, well, there will, but it's not the same story, right? It's not the same characters. Um, it's just one little piece of a larger tapestry, and once you see more of them together, right, I really think that readers will start to see, okay, this is kind of makes sense now. Like, I'm starting to
Mm,
see what this is in a
mhm,
larger scale, right? um, because that's kind of how you have to look at it, right? You
mhm.
when you read a book, you just see this little piece, right? You see these characters in this world in this time period. This is all right here, very self-contained, right?
Yeah.
You know, you might read an epic series where it goes on for centuries, right? And there's lots of different things,
Mhm.
right? um, but for most readers, just see one little glimpse into people's lives. So what I'm trying to do is scale that back a lot and say this is their entire world, right? It's going to take a while. It's going to take a long time to tell all of these stories and how they all fit together. um, but there are definitely those threads that intertwine each of the stories, right? Just like there are threads intertwine each of us, right? You know, when plants root, they intertwine together. And when trees grow together, they all kind of help each other, right? You know, and we were just talking about sequoia trees, right?
Mhm.
Because they're hugely tall, right? They're enormous, and most trees, their root system is as deep as their branch system, right? They go
Mhm.
down as far as they go up, but not the sequoia trees. Sequoia
Mm.
trees only go about 5 feet under the ground, right? But they
Seriously?
they hold on to each other. Their roots intertwine with their neighbors, right?
Wow.
So they
Okay.
all get supported together,
Mhm.
right? And so that it's that community, that it's really important. It's that community of us as Catholics. It's community of us in a local area, right? You know, we buy our eggs from the feed mill down the road in the next town, right? Because they grow
Mhm.
them in their backyard. Um, and we try to buy local produce whenever we can, right? We try to make sure that that's an important part for our family, because when you have everything available to you globally, it just you lose it, right? You lose what the point of it is, right? The point that God's creation is perfect. Everything can come out of the earth in its time, right? Obviously. Um, so we rush it. We take it. We grow things in greenhouses. We grow things on a industrial scale, and then we lose that point, the point that he's trying to make, that he's going to provide for us, he's going to give us what we need, and that we need to look to each other in our smaller communities for what we need rather than our larger global economies.
Yeah. It's like you're saying you lose touch with the fact that you're in this body which is touching the earth in this space, and you're helmed by the hills and the uh, the mountains of your area, which are all fruitful and can and they all mediate or communicate the glory of God, the goodness and the fruitfulness of God. Okay, so one of the reasons we're having this conversation is because we're counting down towards Legendhaven in, gosh, under 2 months now, which is going to be our third con. And I think you attended the last one. Were you at the first one when we first kicked off this thing?
Yep.
Okay, so you're first legend. I think we're calling people who are around for the first year. So you're actually hosting, considering 2 events. I think one is a workshop for the writing camp, and then you're also considering a read aloud on the actual weekend of the con itself. Any thoughts that we're still shaping up the schedule, friends, so you can check the link in the description. You can hit the wait list and you can register. And as we have more details from Zephyr and his events, we're going to add those to the schedule and we'll promote them on social very soon. But any final thoughts you want to leave with us about welcoming people to come and spend a minute with you and chat about all of the things that you love and that they love together about this stuff?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely want to help be able to connect with readers that way. The books that I write aren't super straightforward. That's not like, oh, well, I understand everything about it. I want people to be able to ask questions and to have, to get things explained in more detail. I'd love to discuss details with them. And yeah, the writing project camp seems pretty fun. I definitely want to sit down with people and sort of work with them on, what they've got and how they can, add more of that rural, sensibility, that smaller scale into what they're writing.